Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. Okay, who's in the house on a Friday? Yehudit in South Carolina, little rain in Texas, Renee in Indiana, Gordo in Scotland, Joe in the Inland Empire, Belle in Texas, Franco in Trieste, Italy. Welcome, everybody. I apologize for being a couple minutes late. I'm in the middle of a drama. I just got a call, I don't know, half an hour ago from some woman claiming to be calling me from Bank of America to inform me that a credit card issued in my name that I never heard of was used to purchase, I'm not even going to say on the air, but used to purchase a product that, would take a lot of ID theft in order to purchase. Not the sort of thing that people just buy off the street. The kind of item that takes a lot of licensing and other kinds of matters. And that this credit card purchase went through, but it was flagged, and so they're calling me, and I'm like, yeah, this is nothing to do with me. It's not my card. I never heard of it. And so she's telling me this is a serious matter, and I said, great, bump it up. Have your fraud prevention department call me. How do I know you're from Bank of America? The number didn't say it was from Bank of America. Now she's, going to call me later. I said, let's call NYPD. I mean, if this is identity theft, it's a major thing. She says, yes, we'll refer it to NYPD, but I need to explain your options to you. I don't know. Is this actually Bank of America? I mean, I'm going to call Bank of America and get their fraud department and see if they've heard of this, if there's any reality to this. So hopefully it's just this woman is the scammer trying to do I don't know what. But if indeed it's true, she said that there was a big data breach at AT&T. I'm an AT&T customer. So it's certainly possible that somebody, opened a credit card in my name, but then that it was used to purchase, this kind of product that would require, like I said, a lot of ID and background checks and things like that. Be surprised, if they use my ID for something like that. But okay, then I have to get into it with the police, and I don't know what else would be involved in that. It just sounds like a big hassle, and I hope that, I hope it's the former kind of lesser scam, not the larger scam, and that this woman is actually doing the right thing, trying to help me. I don't know, but anyway. It sucks. I guess it's a part of modern life that we have to deal with these kinds of things. Really, the shame of it is, first of all, if it really is the big scam, I mean, okay, all of us are vulnerable to that. But also, as someone who, I lost my mom a few years ago, and before she passed away, she had real cognitive issues. She had dementia. And of course, there was a period, before the full diagnosis of dementia, and where her care plan began, where she was still responsible for her own matters. And if somebody had tried to scam her during that period, that's what these people are preying on, right? That's what they're trying to do is scam people who are vulnerable for various reasons, especially older people, who may be in cognitive decline. And I think this is just the lowest form of human being that would be trying to make a living scamming people in that situation. And please, God, protect the innocent and bring justice to the criminals, who are trying to get away with stuff like that. So, okay, I'll keep you posted, what kind of scam it is that's going on when I talk to, the bank later today. And who knows if this woman is the real thing or not. But the whole thing, I think, sounds very fishy. That she's telling me that a credit card was issued in my name, and she told me her name, and she said some kind of a badge number, but I don't think people in the fraud department at a bank have a badge number. I said, give me the case number. She said, I'll get back to you with that. I don't know. This whole thing sounds very fishy. And when I said, how come the phone number you're calling me from doesn't say Bank of America? She says, oh, that's a glitch on your end. A glitch on my end? I mean, my cell phone shows the number that's calling me, and I think it's a New York number, but it says wireless caller. I think that's weird, right? That's weird for a Bank of America number. So the whole thing is fishy to me, very fishy. All right. Let's get to our learning for today. We are continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 in chapter 2 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. And in this chapter, we're talking about offerings that get disqualified, not because, let's say, the priest or the owner had an improper intent at the time of slaughter or at the time of sprinkling the blood, etc., as we're looking at in chapter 1. But here, where the priest himself has some kind of a disqualifying element, disqualifying attribute, like the priest is an acute mourner, lost a close relative that day, or is tameh, is ritually impure. What were we just reviewing? I move forward from the Mishna, but it was a list of disqualifications that we got into right before Yom Kippur, right? An acute mourner, or one who was tameh, or one that was no longer fully tameh, but had immersed that day to complete his purification and it's not yet nightfall, so his purification is not complete, or he hadn't brought the offerings, if he was impure by way of tsaras. So he has to bring these atonement offerings. He hasn't brought those yet, or he's not dressed properly. He's not wearing the vestments of a priest, or he didn't wash his hands and feet in the basin where the priest had to wash before doing the service in the holy temple. Or he was sitting when in fact, he needed to be standing. All these kinds of attributes of the priest himself would disqualify the offering. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the acute mourner. Now, in all these offerings, right, so what we're seeing is, first of all, we haven't brought offerings in almost 2,000 years since the Second Temple was destroyed, but okay, we study the laws. And it's important to study the laws so that we understand them, and we can, we can't bring offerings, but in studying the law, there is some of the merit that was available to our ancestors when they could bring offerings. It's still available to us by studying these laws. Now, what's so interesting here is we're not only sort of studying how to bring an offering and what can disqualify an offering, but really going into the logic and the derivation process that our sages use to understand these laws. And as we've talked about several times, that not every element of every kind of offering or of every kind of disqualification is spelled out in the Torah. And so the sages needed to derive, what disqualifies an offering in the case of a sin offering. Will it disqualify an elevation offering, also known as a burnt offering? If having the incorrect intent at one stage of a sin offering, will that it disqualifies the sin offering? Will it disqualify burnt offering if it's used in that same stage? Why would we extend the element from one kind of offering or from one area of the law to another, or why wouldn't we? right? And so today we're going to drill down a little bit even deeper when we're talking about a vachomer inference, right? If in this stringent case we are lenient, then in a more lenient case, all the more so would we be lenient. That kind of logic, that's vachomer logic. So here, the question is, well, that logic sounds good, but sometimes we can apply it and sometimes we can't. And so what's going to make it work and what's going to make it not work? Okay, here we go. We picked this up near the middle, page 16b. Our daf today is page 17. The Mishna teaches that if an acute mourner, right, so again, this is in Hebrew an onein, this is somebody who just lost a close relative that day, and that relative hasn't been buried yet. That's known as an acute mourner. So a priest who is an onein, is an acute mourner, he cannot participate in the temple service. He can't bring offerings on behalf of individuals. And if he does, those offerings are disqualified. So the Mishnah teaches that if an acute mourner collects the blood of an offering, the offering is disqualified. So Rava says they taught this only with regard to an individual's offering. But with regard to a communal offering, a rite performed by an acute mourner does effect acceptance. Okay, so the law is, for example, if more than half of the nation is tameh for some reason, then we can bring their offerings even if the priest is tameh also, but at other times not. I'm not sure if just in a standard situation of bringing a communal offering, like the daily offering, if a priest was an onein, and he brought it, would it be disqualified or not, or is it only in those situations? But okay, for now, let's just say that there definitely are situations where a priest can be an onein and bring an offering, and the offering is not disqualified so long as it's a communal offering. If it was an individual offering, for sure it would be disqualified. Okay, so how do we know that? Why is that the law? Says Rava, one can derive this by a vachomer inference from tuma, right? From being ritually impure. So how are we going to do that? Now try to trace the logic. We'll go slow. So just as the prohibition against performing rites in a state of tuma, being ritually impure, like, for instance, you came into contact either with a sheretz, a dead creeping thing, or a mitzorah, somebody who has tsaras, or a corpse, right? All those things would render you tameh. A person who is tameh is not even allowed to enter the holy temple, except, like I said, in these situations where like half the nation is tameh, so then it might work. Okay, so just as the prohibition against performing rites in a state of tuma, whose general prohibition was not permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual, because no individual offerings can be brought when any priest or high priest, is tameh, was nevertheless permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing a communal offering, as communal offerings may be sacrificed by a priest who is tameh when necessary. That's what I said, like when a certain, you have to hit a certain threshold where a percentage of the population is everybody's tameh, and so you still bring the communal offerings nevertheless. Then, so too, with regard to the prohibition against performing sacrificial rites while in a period of acute mourning, whose general prohibition was permitted in the case of a high priest, even for an individual offering, right? Because a regular priest who becomes an onein, he cannot serve in the temple and bring offerings. But a high priest who becomes an onein can. And the reason is because a high priest, because he's a high priest, even if he becomes an onein, he can't go to the funeral, not even for his parents, right? He can't become tameh for a corpse, even if it's his very close relatives, even if it's his parents, right? You have to do anything you can to honor your parents, and how much more, to bury them when they're dead, with the one exception of all the people, of all the Jews in the world, the one exception is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. because he is pledged to serve the Jewish people, and even if he becomes an onein, he can't leave the temple to become tameh. And because he has that restriction on him, therefore, even if he is an onein, he can bring an offering and it's not disqualified. So we saw that with tuma, if even a regular priest can bring an offering, if it's a communal offering, while tameh, and a high priest can't in the terms of individual offerings, but a high priest can bring an individual offering even if he is an onein, an acute mourner, right? So too, with regard to the prohibition against performing rites while in a period of acute mourning, whose general prohibition was nevertheless permitted for a high priest when he's performing an individual offering, and he may perform all the rites while an acute mourner, just because he's the high priest. Is it not right that this prohibition was permitted in the case of an ordinary priest while performing a communal offering, right? Since a high priest, as an onein, can even bring individual offerings, then it must be that a regular priest, with respect to communal offerings, still can do it, even if he's an onein, given that when it comes to tuma, an ordinary priest can bring communal offerings. Therefore, here in this situation, all the more so, where the high priest, who's an onein, can bring individual offerings, the regular priest should be able to bring communal offerings while he's an onein, right? So that's the derivation for why an onein, regular priest, can bring communal offerings. Does it work? Rava bar Achilai says no. You can't use a vachomer inference to derive that, because you could have run the vachomer in a different direction and come out with a different result. On the contrary, if such an inference can be made, then perhaps one can make the following mistaken inference. The performance of rites in a state of acute mourning should not be permitted in the case of a high priest performing the rites for an individual offering. We said that a high priest can bring individual offerings even if he's an onein. But now we're going to derive by vachomer that he can't. That's not true, but the vachomer could have said so. How? And just as the prohibition against performing sacrificial rites in a state of tuma, whose general prohibition was permitted in the case of an ordinary priest when performing rites for a communal offering, but was not permitted of a high priest when he's performing an individual offering, then so too with regard to the prohibition against performing the rites during a period of acute mourning, whose general prohibition was not permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for communal offering. Is it not right that this prohibition should not be permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites of an individual's offering? Now, it's hard to keep track of this, but the main thing is really what they're saying is you can't compare apples and oranges, right? You can't compare what is permitted for a high priest to do with respect to individual offerings to what an ordinary priest is permitted to do with respect to communal offerings, right? Certainly a high priest outranks an ordinary priest, so there's a kind of relationship that you could establish, but the needs of these offerings are different, and the qualifications and rules that apply to a high priest are different than the rules that apply to an ordinary priest with respect to being an onein that don't apply with respect to tuma. So if you're trying to make these comparisons and say, well, this is stringent and we go even more stringent, therefore we can go even further, the stringency isn't going to hold up when we start to set up seeming parallels that aren't parallels. And similarly, one may claim the performance of rites in a state of tuma should be permitted in the case of a high priest when he's performing an individual offering by another vachomer. How would this one work? And just as the prohibition against performing rites in a state of acute mourning, whose general prohibition was not permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering, or for an individual offering for that matter, and still it was permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual offering, then so too with regard to the prohibition against performing the rites in a state of ritual impurity, tuma, whose general prohibition was permitted only for an ordinary priest or a high priest, but for communal offerings, is it not right that this prohibition was permitted in the case of a high priest performing rites for an individual's offering? Yeah, no, that doesn't work, because when we override tuma for a communal offering, it's an exigent circumstances, right? The whole nation is tameh. That doesn't mean that we can apply, that exception and use it in a kal vachomer to get at whether an onein, ordinary priest, can do a communal offering or not. He can't, right? Because that's a different set, and the restrictions on a high priest don't apply to an ordinary priest with respect to acute mourning. And similarly, you could come up with another false kal vachomer like this. The performance of rites in a state of ritual impurity should not be permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering, which is false, but you could get there through a kal vachomer. Like this. And just as the prohibition against performing rites in a state of acute mourning, whose general prohibition was permitted in the case of a high priest when he's doing an individual's offering, and still it was not permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering, then so too with regard to the prohibition against performing the rites in a state of ritual impurity, tuma, whose general prohibition was not permitted in the case of a high priest when he's performing rites for an individual offering, is it not right that this prohibition should not be permitted in the case of an ordinary priest performing rites for a communal offering, which is not the law, right? But you could have got there if you just depended on the seeming logic of the kal vachomer inference. And the Gemara provides a mnemonic for recalling the above rejections of Rava bar Achilai, him proving that you could use kal vachomers to arrive at the wrong place. And so you should be, the way to remember it, right, is just these phrases, not permitted, onein, tuma, yachid, which means individual, yachid, and tzibur, which means communal. If you were memorizing the Gemara, this would help you. Now we're actually at the top of page 17a. So, rather, one can derive this way and one can derive that way, and since these derivations contradict each other, each and every halakha shall stand in its place and not modify the other by a kal vachomer, right? Since, comparing high priests with respect to individual offerings and communal offerings, with respect to him being an onein or him being tameh, you could draw the wrong inferences if you're going to compare his situation to an ordinary priest with respect to individual offerings and communal offerings, and with respect to being tameh or with respect to being an onein, and you could arrive at wrong inferences. We're not going to use kal vachomer to derive laws in either direction. Okay, new topic. The Mishna, our Mishna here, Mishna number 1, chapter 2, teaches that sacrificial rites performed by one who immersed that day are disqualified. So let's remember what we're talking about here. It's not because he immersed that his participation in bringing offerings would disqualify those offerings. What they're saying is he was tameh and he has not completed his purification from tuma, right? Whatever he needed to do to become tahor, ritually pure, he has done that. The last step was, the second to last step was to immerse in the mikvah, in the ritual bath. And the last step is to wait for nightfall, right? He immerses during the day, but he's not fully tahor until the sun sets, until nightfall that night. So even though he has immersed and he's done all the requirements of what he has to do, the actions that he has to take in order to become tahor, but he's still waiting for nightfall. So he is not fully tahor, and therefore, if he participated in any of the sacrificial offerings, he would disqualify them. That's what it means that one who was immersed that day disqualifies the offerings. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? And the Gemara answers, it is derived, it is taught as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Simei says, from where in the Torah is the allusion with regard to a priest who immersed that day, that if he performed the temple service, he desecrated that service. Why? And not illusion, but allusion, alluding to something. Why is it an allusion? Clearly because it's not explicitly written in the Torah. But they're saying that it is hinted at strongly. That's why they're calling it an allusion. And where is that? It is derived from a verse. The verse states, Leviticus 21:6, they shall be sacred to their God, and they shall not desecrate the name of their God. Right? Now that sounds like stating the same thing twice, that you shall do this and you shall not do that, right? So that's a kind of a repetition that invites interpretation and adding an additional requirement to this law. How does it work? If this verse is not written with regard to the matter of an impure priest who performed the temple service, as that law is derived for us from a different verse, that they separate themselves from the sacred items of the children of Israel, which we looked at 2 days ago, that means that if they're tameh, they can't bring the offerings. So then now, since it seems to say the same thing again, we can apply today's verse to the matter of a priest who immersed that day who performed the temple service. Although he is no longer tameh in every sense, the priest remains tameh in the sense that he is prohibited from partaking of teruma and sacrificial food, and from entering the temple, right? So there you learn in passing what it means to be a tevel yom, right? That means one who is awaiting nightfall, that he has immersed that day, tevel yom, and he's awaiting nightfall. So when he's in that state, what level of tuma does he have? One idea is that we're proving now is that he can't bring offerings as a priest. But also, what are the consequences of being a tevel yom is that he's a priest, therefore he's allowed to eat teruma, but not if he's a tevel yom. Immersed that day in awaiting nightfall. In that state, he cannot eat teruma. He cannot eat sacrificial food, right? The portions of sin offerings that are eaten by priests, he can't eat that while he's a tevel yom. And from entering the temple. He's not even allowed to be in the temple, let alone participating in offerings. Now the Gemara asks, why must the verse be applied to the matter of the tevel yom? Say that one should apply it to the matter of one who creates a bald spot upon his head, or to the matter of one who destroys his beard, as these matters are discussed in the preceding verse. Now, these are prohibitions on all Jewish men, not just priests, that you can't tear out your hair as a sign of mourning for the dead. Thank God that practice seems to have gone out of use in the world. But I guess in the ancient world that was not so uncommon, but it was prohibited for Jews to do that. And destroying your beard. So there are areas of the face where you can't apply a blade. That would be, using a blade to shave your beard. That's destroying the beard. That's prohibited for any Jewish man. You've seen me with what seems like a closely shaved face, but I use an electric razor, and yet, look it up and understand the mechanism of that law. But basically, you can trim your hair with scissors, but you can't shave your face if you're a Jewish man. So using like a blade and shaving cream, that's prohibited. But an electric razor that essentially is acting like many fast-moving mini scissors is permitted. And if you have questions about that, you just Google it and look it up. Okay. So the point is here, why are we extending this prohibition on a priest being a tevel yom and disqualifying offerings? Why not say that, this is something else, that if he, had done this, tore out his hair as a sign of mourning or shaved with a razor, that would disqualify the offering. He's prohibited to do that, but if he did that, would it disqualify the offering? Why not say that? So the Gemara responds, this verse is already used to indicate another law relating to one who immersed that day. From where do we derive that if one who immersed that day performs sacrificial rites, he is liable to receive the punishment of kares, death at the hands of heaven, as it is derived by verbal analogy between profanation, profaning the holy, mentioned in this context, and profanation from teruma, as the verse states in this context, and not profane the name of their God in Leviticus 21:6. And the verse states with regard to teruma, right, food which is consecrated as part of the tithing process and set aside, only priests can eat it, lest they bear sin for it and die therein if they profane it. Only priests can eat teruma, but both the teruma and the priest have to be tahor, in a state of ritual purity. So it can be inferred from this verbal analogy that one who disqualifies teruma, i.e., one who immersed that day, profanes the temple service, and one who does not disqualify teruma, i.e., one who creates a bald spot or destroys his beard, does not profane the service. Right? So that's interesting that if a priest, committed this sin, right, of tearing out his hair for the dead, like I said, it's prohibited, or shaving with a razor, so he violated a prohibition. Now, forget he's in the temple. He's just somewhere else. Somebody brought him some teruma. The teruma is tahor. The priest is tahor. He shaved with a razor that day. Can he eat the teruma? Yes, he can eat the teruma. He's going to have to, if he shaved unwittingly, he's going to bring a sin offering for that. If he did it intentionally, he's going to have to find some other way to make an atonement. But the fact that he violated a prohibition doesn't disqualify him from eating the teruma. And that's how we know that. And so therefore we also know that if he, did those things and he's serving in the temple, he wouldn't disqualify the offering. Now, Rabbah said, why do I need that which the Merciful One wrote, i.e., that a priest who is tameh and one who is a tevel yom, right? A tevel yom is also tameh, but he's further along in his purification process, right? He's immersed and he's just waiting for nightfall. One who's tameh is just fully tameh. He hasn't even started his purification yet. Or maybe he started it, but he hasn't reached the stage of just the only thing left to do is immersing and waiting for nightfall. Okay, so an impure priest and a tevel yom and one who has not yet brought an atonement offering, that all of them disqualify the rites that they perform, wouldn't have been enough to teach the law in only one of these cases, and presumably we could have derived the others, right? So bringing the atonement, that means somebody who had a more complex purification process. It wasn't only required that he immerse in the mikvah and wait for nightfall. This guy needs to immerse in the mikvah, wait for nightfall, and then the next day he has to bring his atonement offerings. So this applies to a mitzorah for sure. I think maybe to a nazir, and I'm sure there's a few other cases. People who have to, as part of their purification process, bring offerings, right? And they're not finished. I don't know about a naziris, but definitely for a mitzorah, right? So he contracted saras. He was quarantined. He finished his quarantine. He's been deemed not to have tzaras anymore. He's going to have to immerse in a mikvah. He's going to have to bring offerings. So until he immerses in the mikvah, gets to nightfall, then the next day brings his offerings, his atonement offerings that are necessary to end his period of being a mitzorah, he is disqualified from serving as a priest and bringing sacrificial offerings. Okay, so Rabbah explains, all three are necessary. Right? We couldn't have learned a Talmud priest, a Tevel Yom, and one who has yet to bring his offerings. That we couldn't have learned all three from the case of one of them. We needed all three because each one teaches us something different. All three are necessary, as in each case there is a stringency not present in the others. Therefore, had the Merciful One written only that a Tameh priest desecrates the service, one might say that this is because he imparts Tuma to others. Right? A person who is Tameh, who comes into contact with another person who's Tahor, can make that person Tameh under certain circumstances. So a Tameh person imparts Tuma to others. And since the other two cases do not, somebody who's a Tevel Yom, once he has immersed and he's awaiting nightfall, he can't serve in the temple. He's not even allowed to enter the temple, but he's no longer so tameh that if he touches someone else, he would impart tuma. He no longer does that. Same for one who has yet to bring offerings. And had the merciful one written the law only with regard to one who immersed that day, the Tevel Yom, then the case of one who has not yet brought an atonement offering could not be derived from it, since the former is unfit to partake of teruma, while the latter is not. Okay, so when you're a tameh and you're a priest, you can't eat teruma. When you're a Tevel Yom and you're a priest, you can't eat teruma. But if you were tameh, you finished all your purification, you immersed that day, and then nightfall came, so you're no longer a Tevel Yom, you just have yet to bring your offerings. At that point, you can't serve in the temple. Maybe you can't even enter the temple. I'm not sure about that. You can't serve as a priest in the temple, but you can eat teruma. So that's a different stringency for the Tevel Yom versus the one who has not yet brought his offerings. Okay. And with regard to the one who has not yet brought his offerings, and if the merciful one had written the law only with regard to the one who has not yet brought an atonement offering, then the case of one who immersed that day, the Tevel Yom, could not be derived from it, since only the former has not yet performed the necessary action, while one who immersed that day must simply wait for nightfall in order to become fully pure. Right? Remember, the Tevel Yom can be referring to a person who all he needs to do is wait for nightfall. Then he's done. Right? There is also a person who hasn't brought offerings yet. He had to immerse. He has to wait till nightfall, but at nightfall, nothing really happens for him yet because he still has to bring offerings tomorrow. But there's other people who had simple tuma, let's say from contact with the sheretz, they immerse in the mikvah. Once nightfall hits, they're done. They don't have to do anything more. They can enter the temple. The next day, they can participate in offerings. They don't have an action that they still need to do. Whereas the one who needs to bring offerings does have an action that he still has to do. So the Gemara asks, still, why are all three necessary? Granted, from one of these cases, the other two cannot be derived, but let one be derived from the other two. So now we're going to go into the logic puzzle like we were doing on, on Wednesday and Tuesday and Monday, where we're trying to derive a law for the third case from the common element between the first two cases. So let's see how it works. The Gemara asks, well, which of the three should the merciful one not write? If one suggests, let the merciful one not write the law with regard to one who has not yet brought the atonement offering and derive it from these other two, the Tameh priest or the Tevel Yom priest, well, one can reply, what is notable about those two? They are notable in that they are unfit to partake of teruma. Since one who has not yet brought atonement offerings may partake of teruma, perhaps he does not disqualify the rites that he performs. So rather say, let the merciful one not write the law with regard to to the Tevel Yom and derive it from these other two, the impure priest and the one who has not yet brought atonement offerings. As what can you say to refute this? One cannot reply, what is notable about these? That they are notable since they have not yet performed necessary action, because ultimately their impurity, i.e. the impurity of one who has not yet brought an atonement offering, is weak when compared to one who immersed that day. And relatively speaking, one who has not yet brought an atonement offering is not considered to be lacking the performance of an action. Generally speaking, but we just said he is considered to be that, at least in certain cases. Now we're on 17b. So the Gemara responds, Rabbah holds that a man who experiences a gonorrhea-like discharge, known as a zav, that's another form of tuma. If you are a zav, then you are tameh, and then you have to go through a purification. And you have to bring offerings. So a zav who has not yet brought his atonement offering is still considered to have the impurity of a zav. The impurity of one who has immersed but has not yet brought an atonement offering is therefore considered stronger than that of one who immersed that day but requires no atonement. So the Gemara notes, and the matter of whether a zav who has not yet brought an atonement offering is still considered a zav is a dispute between Tanaim, as it is taught in a baraisa. If an onein, an acute mourner, or one who has not yet brought an atonement offering, burn the red heifer, it is fit. Okay? Do you have to be a priest to burn the red heifer? We just had this question, but I'm not sure. I think a priest has to burn the red heifer. I'm not sure if a priest has to slaughter the red heifer. But in any case, we don't learn out the law of offerings from the red heifer, because the red heifer, although a matter of the highest holiness, super sacred, is not an offering, right? There's only been 9 red heifers in history. It was slaughtered on a special platform built on the Mount of Olives, opposite the Temple Mount. They slaughter it there, they burn it there, they collect the ashes, and that's what's used for the purification waters that are used to purify a person who came into contact with a corpse. But it's not an offering, even though it's a sacred matter. So here we're learning that, okay, even if it requires a priest, and I think it does, but if he's a tevel yom, or one who has not yet brought, or if he's an onein, or one who has not yet brought atonement offerings, and he burns the red heifer, he has not disqualified the red heifer. But if one who has not yet brought an atonement offering, wait, what? It is fit. I'm sorry. Yosef the Babylonian says, so disagreeing with this first holding, Yosef the Babylonian says, if an onein burned it, it is fit. But one who has not yet brought his atonement offering, if he burned it, it is disqualified. And what? Is it not that they disagree with regard to this? One sage, Yosef the Babylonian, holds that a zav who has not yet brought an atonement offering is considered a full-fledged zav and therefore disqualifies the red heifer. And the other sage, the first Tana, holds that a zav who has not yet brought an atonement offering is not considered a zav, but is instead considered like one who immersed that day, who is fit to burn the red heifer. And the Gemara responds, no. Everyone agrees that he is considered a zav. So we're talking about a priest, if a priest is necessary, who in this situation was a zav, and where is he in his procedure? Because probably now some kind of internet slowdown, but seems to be some. I'm just going to pause for a second. Really? Having issues. It's stuck? Yeah. Okay, is it starting up again now? Just reload it.
Yeah.
It's going?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm just, give me 1 second, just reloading both of my monitors for Facebook and for YouTube. But I think we're back. Okay. Okay, so the point is here we were they're going to learn out, what we can do about, we're comparing the Tevel Yom, we're comparing the full-fledged Tameh priest to the Tevel Yom, to the one who has not yet brought atonement offerings. And to help us understand why we can't learn out any one of their requirements from the other two. Now we're taking a moment to look at the law of a Zav priest, who had this gonorrhea-like discharge, and then went through some of his purification, or a priest who's an onein, and whether they disqualify a red heifer if after it's slaughtered they burn it to create the ashes for the waters of purification. So let me just back up. So the Gemara notes, and the matter of whether a Zav who has not yet brought atonement offerings is still considered a zav is a dispute between Tanaim. As it is taught in a Baraisa, if an onein or one who has not yet brought atonement offerings burn their heifer, it is still fit. But Yosef the Babylonian says, if an onein burned it, it is fit. But one who has not yet brought an atonement offering, if he burned it, it is disqualified. And what is it that they disagree about? One sage, meaning Yosef the Babylonian, holds that a zav who has not yet brought an atonement offering is considered a full-fledged zav and therefore disqualifies the red heifer. And the other sage in this argument, the first Tana, holds that a zav who has not yet brought an atonement offering is not considered a zav, but is instead considered like one who immersed that day, and he is fit to burn the red heifer even though he hasn't brought his atonement offerings. Right? So why are we talking about a zav? That's just the case that led to being either a tevel yom or one who has not yet brought offerings. So the Gemara responds, no. Everyone agrees that he is considered a zav because he hasn't finished his process yet. So until he finishes. He's still a Zav. And here, what the Tanaim disagree with regard to is this. As it is written with regard to the ritual of the red heifer, quote, and the pure person shall sprinkle the water of purification. That's Numbers 19:19. So the preceding verse already states that the one performing the service must be tahor, ritually pure. Therefore, by stating pure again, this verse emphasizes that he needs to be pure enough only to perform the rite of the red heifer specifically. By inference, one derives that he may be impure in some way that disqualifies him for other rites, even though it wouldn't disqualify him here. And isn't the red heifer, which has only been 9 of them in all history, and it's such an important ritual, wouldn't have the highest levels of stringency? No, because it's not a sacrificial offering. So that there are other rites, sacrificial offerings in the temple, that do have a higher level of stringency. So by inference, one derives that he may be impure in some way that disqualifies him from other rites, but is okay for the red heifer. This teaches that one who immersed that day, but is awaiting nightfall, is fit to participate in the ritual of the red heifer. Now, the Tanaim disagree as to the extent of this law. One sage, the first Tana, holds that it is referring to any state of impurity mentioned anywhere in the Torah, i.e. anyone who immersed that day due to any impurity may participate in the rite of the red heifer if all he needs to do is wait for nightfall to finish his purification, and it doesn't matter what led to his impurity. And the other sage, in this dispute that we're alluding to, Yosef the Babylonian, holds that it is referring specifically to one who was in a state of impurity mentioned in this passage, namely tuma contracted from a corpse. And why are we talking about corpse tuma? Because that's what the red heifer purifies from. The only type of impurity that requires the red heifer for its purification is when you come into contact with a corpse. And therefore you would be tameh for 7 days. You'd have to be sprinkled with the waters of purification, which are, water mixed with ashes from the red heifer on the 3rd and 7th day. Then you immerse in the mikveh. Then you wait for nightfall, and only then are you free of your corpse tuma. Therefore, according to Yosef the Babylonian, with regard to an onein, the acute mourner, and we were talking about this in the context of priests, because they're the ones bringing Zevachim, offerings. So with regard to an onein and one who immersed that day, the Tevel Yom, after becoming impure due to contact with the carcass of a creeping animal, a sheretz, the carcass of a creeping animal is a type of tuma, but it is not corpse tuma. Corpse tuma only refers to human corpse tuma. If you attend a funeral, you help bury the individual, you carry the coffin. You don't have to actually touch the body to have corpse tuma. There's other ways to contract it, but the point is it's emanating from a corpse, a human corpse. Okay, so what about if your tuma was not from a corpse, from a sheretz, right? From the carcass of a creeping animal? Since they are treated more leniently than corpse tuma, they are derived, kal vachomer, from the case of one who, from the Tevel Yom, of corpse tuma, and they are fit to participate in the rite of the heifer, the red heifer. But with regard to a zav who has not yet brought an atonement offering, who is treated more stringently because he has still positive actions that he needs to do to finish his purification, since his impurity emerges onto him from his own body rather than being imparted to him from without, either from somebody else's corpse or a sheretz or a mitzvah or whatever, one does not derive that he is fit to participate in the rite of the red heifer. The kal vachomer doesn't work in that situation, and this is, further evidence that we can't use kal vachomers willy-nilly just because it sounds logical, because if we can interrupt the flow of logic by saying that the two sides that are being compared don't just differ in one area, but differ in multiple areas, then we can't extend the law from one to the other. Okay. New topic. The Mishna teaches that a priest lacking the requisite priestly vestments. Okay, we're going back to our Mishnah 1 here in chapter 2. And we're talking about other kinds of factors that would disqualify an offering that a priest brought because of something that was lacking in the priest. Now we're talking about if he's dressed wrong. Right? A priest has to wear the priestly vestments. If he's not wearing the priestly vestments, then his offering is disqualified. So the Mishnah teaches that a priest lacking the requisite priestly vestments disqualifies the rites he performs. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? So Rabbi Avu says that Rabbi Yochanan says, and some determined it to be stated in the name of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, as the verse states, and you shall gird them with belts, Aaron and his sons, and bind miters, M-I-T-R-E-S, a mitre, I think it's a type of turban, and bind miters on them, and they shall have the priesthood by a perpetual statute. That's Exodus 29:9. And this verse indicates that when their vestments are on them, the priesthood is on them. But if their vestments are not on them, their priesthood is not upon them, and therefore their rights are disqualified. A Kohen who's not dressed in the priestly vestments is still a Kohen, but if he brings offerings in the Holy Temple when he's not wearing the priestly vestments, those offerings are disqualified. Do we use some kind of a vachomer to derive that? No, it's spelled out in the Torah according to this reading of it. But then Gemara challenges this and says, whoa. Is this halacha, is this law derived from here? It is derived from there, a different place. As it is taught in a baraisa, from where is it derived? That if those who drank wine performed sacrificial rites, they have desecrated the service. Okay, now this was not mentioned in our Mishnah, but a priest who drank wine, this is like apparently a zero tolerance issue, right? It's not, was he drunk or not? It wasn't like, what was his blood alcohol level? They didn't have breathalyzers in the ancient world. So a priest can't drink wine and serve in the temple. I don't know how many hours, is it, on the same day? I'm not, what are the actual requirements of it? But the bottom line is a priest can't drink wine and serve in the temple, right? Where do we learn that out from? Well, this was the next law given after the incident of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, who the Torah tells us somewhat cryptically, they brought strange fire. This was the very beginning, right after the tabernacle had been erected, and Aaron and his sons sworn in. He is the high priest and his sons as the priests. He had 4 sons. And it was a matter of time, tremendous celebration. The Torah commanded us to build the tabernacle and the altar and the aron and all these things. And we built all those things and inaugurated those things and we're celebrating. And then I think that very night or the next day, they brought strange fire into the altar. And, a heavenly fire came and consumed them, killed them. Right? And we learn elsewhere that it wasn't like their bodies were burnt to a toast. Their bodies were intact, but their souls had left their body. They were dead. And obviously this is national tragedy, not just a family tragedy for Aaron, who lost his 2 sons, and Moses, their uncle. But then the next teaching is that priests shall not drink wine when they enter the temple or the tabernacle. And so that led some commentators to say, well, perhaps they had drunk wine when they did this. That's not proven. We don't know that for a fact at all. And there's other very interesting teachings that what they were intoxicated with wasn't alcohol. It was the desire to be near to God, right? And so they kind of went above and beyond the law and just, created their own offering, created their own manner of approach, and in that sense didn't respect the law that God had given, and in their desire, to come closer to God, sadly, they lost their lives. But let's see what it says here. The Gemara asks, but is the law derived from here? Now we're examining why is it that if they're not wearing the right clothes, it's disqualified. And now we're going to look at the law of alcohol. So let's see why. From where is it derived that those who drank wine and performed sacrificial rites, that they have desecrated the service? The verse states, with regard to the priests, drink no wine or strong drink, you, nor your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, so that you do not die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may put difference between the holy and the mundane. That's Leviticus 10, verses 9 and 10. So not drinking, that seems pretty explicit, but what's explicit is the prohibition. It's not explicit that if you violate the prohibition, you have disqualified the service. You've desecrated the service and disqualified the offerings. It doesn't say that. It just says they're prohibited to do this. But it does say that you will profane, right? So that you do not die. No, it says so that you do not die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may put difference between the holy and the common. And that's not the language you've seen elsewhere, that you profane my offerings or you profane the tent of meeting. Here it's that so that you don't drink, so that you know how to so that you may distinguish between the holy and the mundane. So the Baraisa, this teaching continues with regard to one lacking the requisite vestments and one whose hands and feet are not washed. From where is it derived that their rights are disqualified as well? Right, like a priest who drank is going to produce the same result as one who didn't wash his hands or didn't wear the priestly vestments, namely that the offerings would be disqualified. Now we're at the top of page 18a. The verse states statute, right? Statute. Statute is the translation we're using for chukah, right? Chukah, or a chok, this is talking about the laws that are supra-rational in the Torah. Statute is being used to indicate a law that we don't understand. We don't understand the logic behind it. Like, thou shalt not murder. That's more of a mishpat. We understand why God commanded us not to murder. But when God says you can't eat milk and meat together, or you have to wear these clothes or it's disqualified, or you can't even have a sip of wine and enter the temple, that's because God said so, right? So the verse states chukah with regard to those who drank wine, and it likewise states chukah with regard to the priestly vestments. So with regard to the washing of the hands and with regard to the washing of the hands and feet. So one therefore derives by verbal analogy that the law in all three cases is the same. So if so, there is already a source for the law that one who lacks the requisite priestly vestments disqualifies the service, right? We were able to say, okay, well, let's take it as a given that one who drank, a priest who drank and then brings an offering, disqualifies the offering. And since the word statute is used in that law and also in the requirement that they wash their hands and feet and wear the priestly vestments, therefore, if they didn't do those things, they're going to disqualify the offering. Since we've already proven that, then why are we going to use this derivation that we introduced here? So the Gemara responds to this challenge by saying, if one derived the law only from there, I would say this matter, i.e. that the rights of one who lacks the requisite vestments are disqualified, applies only to a right for which a non-priest is liable to receive charis, death at the hands of heaven. Since that is the topic of the passage discussing one who drank wine. It says statute about him, but it also says that one who drank wine and enters the temple is subject to death at the hands of the heavenly court, charis, right? Which is what happened to Nadav and Avihu. But with regard to a right for which a non-priest is not liable to receive charis, I will say that they are not subject to this law. Therefore, the verse teaches us that the law applies to all rights. And the Gemara asks, we found a source for the law that one lacking the requisite vestments disqualifies all rituals, even those for which a non-priest is not liable to receive charis. From where do we derive that the law is the same for those who drank wine, as the passage in Leviticus addresses only rights for which a non-priest would receive the death penalty? And the Gemara responds, it is derived by verbal analogy between the word statute used there and the word statute from the verses discussing one lacking the vestments. And the Gemara says, well, whoa. But doesn't the Tana, the aforementioned Baraisa, derive that the rights of those who drank wine are disqualified from the verse that you may put difference between the holy and the common? And not by verbal analogy to a priest lacking the requisite vestments? And the Gemara responds that you may put difference between the holy and the common is the source of this law only before the verbal analogy stands. once the verbal analogy is derived, it is the source of the law with regard to those who drank wine as well, right? That law, we needed to teach one thing. Once we were able to derive that teaching from a different place, then that verse became available to teach a different law. So the Gemara challenges, but doesn't the Tana de Baraisa derive the law with regard to one lacking the requisite vestments itself from the case of those who drank wine? And the Gemara responds, actually, the disqualification rights performed by one who drank wine is derived from the case of one lacking vestments. And this is what the Tana is saying. From where is it derived that there is no distinction between one lacking the requisite vestments and those who drank wine and those whose hands and feet are not washed, and that all three disqualify the rights? Because the verses all use the word statute in order to derive a verbal analogy. And the Gemara asks, but if the law that one who drank wine disqualifies the service is derived from verbal analogy, why do I need the verse that you may put difference between the holy and the common? And the Gemara responds, that verse is necessary in accordance with the custom of Rav. As Rav would not place an interpreter before him, i.e. he would not lecture in public, from the time that he drank wine on one festival day until the other, the second festival day, due to drunkenness. Rav was concerned that he would not issue a proper ruling because it was customary to drink wine on the festivals. And the verse states, and that you may put a difference between the holy and the common, and between the impure and the pure, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken, indicating that one who drank wine may not issue a halachic ruling. Seemingly, that verse, once it became unnecessary for priests serving in the temple, it could be used to say, well, God, what are the roles of the priests? Originally, they were also teachers who had to, communicate to the public, well, this is how you bring an offering, this is what is permitted, this is what not permitted, right? There wasn't a tradition of rabbis in the early days, right, after the Torah had been given. 1,000 years later, there was. So what Rav is saying is, okay, since we don't need this verse to teach us that a priest can't enter the temple after drinking, let's use it to say that a priest may not issue halakhic rulings, and therefore anyone who issues halakhic rulings cannot do so if he has imbibed alcohol. Great ruling, right? Now, this is a custom of Rav, so we can't say it has the force of a halacha, but it's probably one of those customs, minhagim, that has been brought down and acquired the force of law. I'm pretty sure that if you go to a Rav or your Rav and you need a halakhic ruling on a question of, can I do something, can I not do something, if he's had, what to drink and is tipsy and buzzed, he'll say, you know what, I'll give you an answer tomorrow, right? Because that's, I would think, what he should do. So the Gemara, so that's what he's doing with that verse. But is that the only thing we do with that verse? So the Gemara asks still, is the disqualification of rites performed by one lacking requisite vestments derived from here, i.e. from the verse, and you shall gird them with belts, Aaron and his sons, in Exodus 29:9? But it is derived from a different verse, and the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar, in Leviticus 1:7. Now, the superfluous term, the priest, in this verse, which you would have understood if it wasn't there, especially in the context, serves to indicate that he may serve only in his priestly state. What's his priestly state? He's already a Cohen. You can't become a Cohen. You're born a Cohen. What makes you in your priestly state? You're dressed as a priest, right? Wearing the requisite vestments. So the verse therefore teaches that with regard to a high priest who wore the vestments of an ordinary priest and performed sacrificial rites, his service is disqualified. Interesting. Sounds like a high priest is a high priest, even if he's doing an ordinary service that doesn't require a high priest to do it. If he's dressed as an ordinary priest, that would be disqualified because, in fact, he's a high priest and he has to always wear the uniform of his office, right? Very interesting teaching. People of high office have to present themselves appropriately, spiritually speaking. There's some people in our community, right, and our from, Orthodox, like really observant community, only some, right? There's plenty of us who you can see us walking around in the neighborhood, when we're not going to shul, we're not going to synagogue, we're not involved in anything, we're just taking a walk around the block and we're dressed in sweats. But there's some people that wouldn't leave the house in sweats. They feel like anytime they're walking around in this world, they're walking before the Holy One, blessed be He. Right? We're always in the throne room, so to speak. There's never a time when we're not in God's presence. And so they think it is proper to always be dressed in a dignified fashion. Maybe that's a little bit related to this teaching about the high priest who has to be wearing the clothes of the high priest. And the Gemara responds to this saying, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara responds, if one derived the law only from there, I would say this matter applies only to service that is indispensable for effecting atonement. But service that is not indispensable for effecting atonement, for example, putting fire upon the altar, is not subject to this law. Therefore, the verse in Leviticus 1:7 indicates that the law applies even to rites that are not indispensable. And the Gemara asks, but still the law derived from here, i.e. from all the previous, is the law derived from all these sources? But it is derived from an entirely different place. And the sons of Aaron, the priests, shall lay the pieces and the head and the fat in order upon the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar, with respect to certain kinds of offerings where they have to bring up the portions of the offering that are burned on the altar. And in this verse, the superfluous term, the priests, serves to indicate that the priests may serve only in their priestly state. So from here one derives with regard to an ordinary priest who wore the vestments of the high priest and performed sacrificial rites that his service is disqualified. Now the reverse direction. If an ordinary priest was wearing the clothes of a high priest when in fact he's not a high priest, then anything he did is disqualified. And the Gemara responds, if one derived the law only from there, I would say this matter applies only to a lack of vestments. For example, a high priest who wore fewer than his requisite 8 vestments. But an excess of vestments, for example, an ordinary priest who wore more than his requisite 4, would not be subject to the law. Therefore, this verse comes to tell us that the law applies even to an excess of vestments. If he's wearing less than he's supposed to or more than he's supposed to, it's going to disqualify the service. That's where we'll knock off. I'll take a couple of comments. Not easy material, but as you see, we're doing a real deep dive on how the sages derive the requirements of one offering from another. And I think more interesting even is when they stop themselves and say, no, we can't make that comparison. We can't extend this law from this area to that area because there's other factors involved that distinguish those two kinds of offerings or those two kinds of people or those two conditions that one priest might have. And therefore we can't learn out from here to there. And that kind of limitation on what the priest will, what the sages of the Gemara would derive versus what they would not allow themselves to derive. I think that restraint in their interpretive latitude, I think, is fascinating. Okay, Michelle, was there a ritual cleansing of the temple? So I'm wondering what you mean by ritual cleansing. If you're saying, when we say ritual, we usually mean like purification, right? So do we purify people, as we've talked about, things that people that became tameh can become tahor, and there are items. Some of them can be purified, some cannot, right? Depending if it's made of metal, made of glass, made of clay, made of wood. Some things can be rendered pure and some cannot. What about places, right? Places. A house can have tsaras. There's tsaras of a dwelling, but we don't actually purify it. A priest comes to inspect it, and either it has tsaras or it doesn't, right? If it does, then it has to be torn down. And then I guess the place is purified because we could rebuild the house. I think we have to replace the stones, but that's not really a ritual cleansing. We're replacing the house. If you're just talking about cleaning, like regular cleaning of the temple, for sure, there was cleaning. What's interesting is how they would clean the Holy of Holies, right? Which only a high priest can enter on Yom Kippur. And he's got a lot to do that day, and he is not cleaning the Holy of Holies. right? Which is a room like any other that has openings. I mean, it has a curtain covering, but it's not, a vacuum seal. Dust will collect in there. Problem, it needs cleaning. But only a high priest can go in, and he's not cleaning it on Yom Kippur. So how would they clean that room? And we learned a few years ago that they had a procedure for that. They had like Mission Impossible, like a service person would come in on a rope suspended from the ceiling, never touch the floor, but be lowered very carefully, do the cleaning, and then be pulled back out. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, what kind of ritual cleansing we're talking about. But other than that, was there some kind of, it's not like they're sprinkling holy water. There's no such thing as holy water, but waters of purification on areas of the temple that's only used to purify people. There's cleaning for sure, especially after Pesach, right? When there's so many Pesach lambs that would be slaughtered. Michelle, just basic cleaning. Yeah. So yeah, there was basic cleaning, regular cleaning along these lines. Okay. And finally, Sharon, but don't you become tameh when you prepare the red heifer? Yes, you do. Yes, you do. But you can't be tameh when you start. That's always a great, topic for rabbis to talk about. Is the only way to become purified from corpse tumah is with the ashes of the red heifer. So this should be the great purifying agent. And yet, the one who slaughters the red heifer and then who burns the red heifer becomes tameh. In that process, why is that? And there's a lot of answers that are offered, but I think he can't be tameh before he starts. He has to do it in a state of tahara, and then after he's completed it, because he's been, involved in this killing of the red heifer, he becomes tameh. Like I said, there's other teachings. I'm not having one come to mind right now, but he does have to be tahor when he begins that. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Motzi Shabbos, right? Getting earlier and earlier. So, I'm trying to get on before 9, before 8:30 maybe. What is candle lighting? It always takes me a little bit of time when I get back from shul on Saturday night, but Shabbos is ending like 7:20. Then we do Havdalah. I walk home. I have to get myself back up and moving. But I think I can get on tomorrow night before 8:30 Pacific, maybe even earlier than that. Right? Gonna really try hard to get on by 8:15. So it's 8:15, 8:30 tomorrow. That's what I've got for us today. May we all be blessed to enter Shabbos with peace, to hear good news, to be uplifted, to carry, this new and cleansed soul that we, our souls were cleansed on Yom Kippur. So it's not just that we're, mostly or all are totally free of sin right now because we went through, God willing, the process of atonement on Yom Kippur. But now we also have to be thinking forward, right? Not just how am I going to avoid committing those sins this year, but let's get in touch with who we are. What is our mission, right? Okay, we're cleansed, but for what purpose? What do we need to be doing? What is my mission in this world? How can I, affect it and achieve it more in this year? This is an incredible time to be asking ourselves that question over and over. And then as we build our sukkahs, that fragile structure that we kind of begin our year in, where we're close to God, we're surrounded by God, we're aware of God's presence, and God is rooting for us, right? To do great things in the coming year, and may we be blessed to do them. And we say amen.